Hi, Eugene Mulero here for Capital Agenda, and joining us today is Jeff Davis, Senior Fellow at the Eno Center for Transportation in Washington, D.C. And Jeff, we're looking at a lame duck session. Congress is back. The Republicans are running the show for the lame duck through December 16th, and they have some business to take care of, such as keeping the government funded. What are you going to be looking for in the lame duck?
Well, number one with a bullet, obviously, is funding the government through the annual appropriations process. And the staffs of the House and Senate Appropriations Committees have been working for the last 2 months behind the scenes trying to negotiate an omnibus appropriations package that contains the remaining 11 bills to fund the government through next September. But the election kind of changes the dynamic of that, because rather than negotiate a spending package with conditions that President Obama will find acceptable, there's now a huge push, especially amongst House Republicans, to kick the can down the road, extend the current short-term stopgap that expires December 9th through late February or early March, so that they can negotiate not just spending levels for fiscal 2017, but also the various conditions of what you can and cannot do with the money with President-elect Trump next year instead of President Obama right now. So there are going to be meetings this week and early next week between the leaders in Congress to try to figure out if they're going to get that done. But the dynamic really does appear to have swung towards kicking it into next year rather than finishing with an omnibus in the lame duck, because they'll have much more leverage next year.
Does this have an impact on transportation issues? Are we looking at an opportunity for conservative House Republicans to inject policy, favorite policy decisions into an appropriations bill next year?
There may be some of that, because if you're, I worry more about a government shutdown happening next February or March with overreach, because the CR is the perfect place, the appropriations bill is the perfect place to do things like, well, if you want to cut off funding, federal funding for sanctuary cities, it's a lot easier and quicker to do that in the appropriations bill, saying no funding for cities that do this, than it is to pass a separate bill that goes through the House and the Senate subject to filibuster. And so it becomes a question of how many different conditions of funding and changes of the rules can Republicans tack on to this omnibus appropriations bill in February or March before Senate Democrats filibuster it to the point that the government shuts down for a while we have a standoff. I worry that that's going to happen. And then you'll have even more changes once Republicans and President-elect Trump have an opportunity to develop appropriations bills based on Trump's budget that'll be coming in next February or March.
Exactly. What about if the appropriators punt to next spring, let's say, for the fiscal 2017 funding bills? What about the dynamics of the chairmanships, the leadership? What if, there's new leadership at the top in the House? Would that have a play in everything?
There will be new leadership at the top of the House. Hal Rogers, who has chaired the House Appropriations Committee for the last 6 years, is term limited. It appears that Rodney Frelinghuysen from New Jersey will be elected to replace him. We'll know that in a couple of weeks.
Exactly.
But except for the top dozen or so big issues, most of the work is done at the subcommittee level, not the full committee level, and shouldn't change that much between now and next spring.
Okay, we'll be looking at the lame duck very carefully.
I will say also we're hopefully going to get a water resources development bill done in the lame duck session. Negotiations have been going pretty well on that too. So hopefully that'll get finalized in a couple of weeks.
And just to pivot quickly on the elections, you guys at the Eno Center were tracking ballot measures on your website, and we've reported on many of the states and what they did, and $200 billion of transportation money was at play in these elections.
There was $200 billion just in Los Angeles County, California, and the Seattle area, Washington, of two half-cent sales taxes that were going to raise that much money over the next 30 years. And there were many, many other ballot initiatives where localities generally agreed to increase taxes to pay for local road and mass transit improvements. So that's good news overall.
What jumped at you? Is this the whole concept of the states taking it to themselves to do what the federal government is not doing for them? Is that what we're looking at?
Well, yeah, ever since the stimulus and money that was provided in 2009 ran out, states have been kind of anticipating when is the next huge surge of federal money coming, and there's been not a huge surge coming, and it's probably not going to come until, depending on if President Trump's plan provides real grants to states versus loans to states and then localities. There's a big difference between what you've got to pay back and what you don't. But yeah, they've decided sort of to take their fortunes into their own hands and look to the future to provide their own infrastructure.
And speaking of the elections, real estate mogul Donald Trump won, and he beat out Hillary Clinton, and he was touting a 10-year, $1 trillion infrastructure and funding plan. And on his campaign website, he touched on this, and it's the plan driven by the National Association of Manufacturers, they mentioned a 10-year funding gap that is approximately $1 trillion. And the Trump campaign was saying that they want to achieve a target that will fill that $1 trillion gap. This is, not to state the obvious, a lot of money, and we've had president-elects before Trump that were talking about infrastructure funding, and infrastructure has been a theme of many candidates before. How realistic is this plan?
Again, most of what President Trump is talking about is financing as opposed to funding. It's not a question of the Treasury Department writing checks to build things. It's a question of getting bond issuances, doing it through borrowing, paid for whether by corporate tax repatriation or by using some kind of tax credit bonds to encourage rich people to invest in infrastructure bonds instead of the stock market. And so to the extent that a lot of that is useful, but bonds have to be repaid. And so it is much more useful for projects that can have some kind of revenue stream going forward to repay the bonds, whether it's a toll or what have you, or a local property tax or a local sales tax levy or what have you. So it's an important step, but it needs to be distinguished from actual grants. And we'll wait and see the details on it. But as you can see, the stock market has already priced in some kind of huge Trump stimulus. Engineering company, construction material stocks have gone through the roof in the last 6 days. So, and we'll hopefully know more about this. Again, everything comes down to what's in President Trump's initial budget outline submitted, usually in late February, early March, is what Reagan and Clinton and Bush II and Obama did. And every part of his agenda that has a fiscal impact needs to have some kind of placeholder in there to make all the numbers add up.
Correct, some offsets. When the budget is received on Capitol Hill, we're going to be looking for how it's received and what reception it gets. Already, I read an interview in Congressional Quarterly that Congressman Mario Diaz-Balart, he's a top transportation funding leader in the House, was encouraged by the infrastructure plan that the Trump administration is expected to advance. What do you think will be the appetite for infrastructure negotiations and a funding bill on highway projects specifically? And I say this because already I've heard interviews and saw press conferences with the congressional leaders talking about reminding people that we got the FAST Act, and the FAST Act expires in 2020.
Procedurally, it's going to be easier to add money on top of what's in the FAST Act in new programs or money on top of existing programs than it's going to be to reopen all of the deal cutting that was done during the FAST Act. So I would expect President Trump's plan to go on top of the FAST Act rather than amend the FAST Act. The question is if his FAST Act expires September 2020, and to the extent that President Trump's plan goes longer than that, how will they relate? Because the Highway Trust Fund is going to run out of money in 2021. So that's a real question. The Chamber of Commerce, I talked to them and some other people in the transportation sector, want to keep a focus on President Trump and the Congress to make sure that long-term stability for the Highway Trust Fund past the end of the FAST Act is also considered when you're talking about a 10-year infrastructure plan.
Anything about the Trump administration when it kicks off in January that you're really going to be looking out for?
We're curious as to what his take, because we have to do a aviation bill next year. Congress punted on that one. So policy-wise, it's, as opposed to just funding, policy-wise, aviation's where he's going to have his first opportunity to make his mark. Is he going to go with what Chairman Schuster in the House wants to do with a more fundamental reconception of how the federal government does air traffic control, or will he go with more of the same?
Yep, and Congressman Bill Schuster, reelected, defeating a Tea Party-backed candidate. He's going to be back chairing the House Transportation Committee. Jeff, if we can leave it there, thank you so much for joining us in Transport Topics. And tune in at ttnews.com for Capitol Agenda on Tuesdays when Congress is in session. Thanks.